Welcome to our first introduction to genetics. This video is going to be quite lengthy, but it is going to cover some of the history and the original thoughts on the science of genetics and heredity. It's going to start off with this man right here. This is the 19th century friar or priest known as Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel is going to be considered our father of genetics. He worked in a monastery in Austria, and he kind of had a secluded life, and he didn't really want to be there, but that's just kind of how things ended up for him. And he spent a lot of his time working with pea plants, and he started crossbreeding and taking notes and doing experiments with these pea plants, and eventually he's going to come up with our theory of heredity. It is not going to be recognized at the time. In fact, it's going to be kind of shuffled off to the side. A lot of people aren't going to really listen to him. And then years later, someone else is going to start doing some work on it and stumble upon his work and finally realize how significant it actually was. And it really was very significant, as we will soon find out. Heredity, just for your knowledge, is the passing of physical characteristics from parent to offspring. So it's why you look the way you do and what traits you have based on what your parents were able to supply you. This is the nature side of things. There's also a nurture side, which is how you are shaped by your experiences. So both play a part in who you are, but heredity is going to be the nature side. What did your parents give you at birth that you have to work with right now? So Mendel's going to sit there and he's going to wonder why different pea plants had different physical characteristics. I mean, you might look around the room and notice why some students look different than you do and wonder why. But it has to deal with heredity and what traits their parents passed on to them. Here's our pea plants. There's a whole list of different characteristics Mendel looked at. You can reference page 79 down here for them. But here's a couple of them. For our purposes, we're going to stick with this tall versus short trait. So you're going to see me drawing a lot of T's for tall and actually lowercase t's for short. But keep in mind, this whatever we do with tall and short, it's also going to be done with the other ones. We just use different letters for different alleles, and we'll get to that. But yes, he's going to cross pea plants. A trait is a form of the characteristics. So let's say your characteristic is hair color. That would be your characteristic. Your trait would be whether you're blonde, brunette, red, or even if you decide to change that to some kind of weird purple color or something, whatever. But that would be your actual trait. Your traits are often similar to your parents. So, for example, I'm pretty tall. Both my parents are pretty tall, so therefore our offspring was pretty tall. That makes a lot of sense. But however, sometimes they're going to be different too. And there's a lot of different factors that go into it. We're going to be starting with Mendelian traits, which are actually pretty simple to understand. Other traits are going to be a lot more complex, and that'll be a later chapter. Genetics is the scientific study of heredity. And again, Mendel's work is going to lead to the foundation of this science, and he is going to be considered the father of genetics. So let's look at Mendel's experiments. What he's going to do is he's going to cross-pollinate pea plants. He's going to take some pollen from one pea plant, mix it with another pea plant, and get an offspring. And hopefully we're going to be able to see the difference in traits after he goes. So he's going to start by getting purebred organisms. These organisms are going to be genetically similar when it comes to your alleles, but for our cases right now, the offspring of these generations are going to have the same trait. So for generations and generations and generations, the offspring always had the same trait. In doing so, Mendel is going to actually make it so the allele combination, which we'll get to what alleles are, is the same for each generation. So purebred right now is going to be that they had many generations before them had the same trait. Later on, purebred simply just going to mean they have two of the same alleles. So we have an F1 generation. The F1 generation is going to be our first phenol. This is going to be the offspring of the parent generation. So if you want to think of your parents as the parent generation, you would be the F1 generation. Your parents would be the P generation. In Mendel's experiments, your parents are going to be purebred. So they are going to have the same alleles, and they are going to have generations of generations of generations having the same trait. Your F2 generation would be your offspring, and we'll get to that in a second. What he's going to do is he's going to take this this F1 generation, he's going to take this parent generation in order to get the F1 generation. He's going to breed a tall pea plant that is purebred with a purebred short pea plant. So he did some breeding for generations and generations of pea plants, and he got tall ones and short ones, and he took this tall one, and then he decided to cross-pollinate it with a short one. The F1 generation is going to produce all tall pea plants. 100% of the time, those pea plants will be tall. This is going to mask the short trait. It's not going to be seen in this generation. But in the F2 generation, it will come back. The F2 generation is going to be him taking the F1 generation and self-pollinating them. So we're going to take our offspring from our parents' generation, we're going to pollinate it with ourselves, which plants can do, and you're going to get an F2 generation. In this F2 generation, 3/4 of the offspring are going to be tall and 1/4 will be short. And just keep in mind, remember that both parents in this situation were technically the same plant, but they were both tall. And he could have done it with other plants from the F1 generation because they all had the same trait anyways. So the F1 generation is only going to form one trait, is going to show. Only the tall trait showed. The F2 generation, that lost trait, showed up 1/4 of the time in the plants. The reasoning behind this is because each parent is going to contribute a trait to the offspring. So you're going to get one factor from the mother, one factor from the father, and whichever one is going to be dominant is going to mask the recessive. So in this case, tall is going to mask short. Genes and alleles. Alleles are the factors that control the trait. So those are the things that mom and dad are both giving to your offspring. Your genes are going to be what they actually get encoded into your chromosomes. So in our case, we have purebred, which means they have two of the same alleles. So let's do tall and tall here. And these are both going to be tall alleles. So this plant here together, this guy right here, he got one from his mom, one from his dad, and they were both tall, and he's a tall plant. Over here, his parent generation had two short plants, or two short alleles. So here's a lowercase t and here's a lowercase t. You got this one from dad, this one from mom, and he's going to breed them. So this here is your parent generation, or your P generation. In doing so, you're going to get 4 different offspring. However, each 4 different offspring is going to have the same alleles. There's going to be tall, short, because again, he gets one from this parent and one from this parent. This parent can only give tall, this parent can only give short. And this guy here is going to get one tall, one short, one tall, one short, one tall, one short. So you see each one of these offspring have the same combination, and because we're saying tall is dominant, they're all going to be tall. This is your F1 generation. He's then going to cross the F1 generation, so let's just take these two and cross them and get 4 pea plants. You can get one from each of the parents, so let's say the first 2 get this capital T from dad, and the second 2 are going to get the lowercase t from dad. And let's do The same for this one here. Let's say the first two here are going to get the lowercase, or the first one here is going to get the capital T, and the second one gets the lowercase t. This one here gets the capital T. This one here gets the lowercase t. So as you can see, this here is your F2 generation, where this guy here is tall, this guy here is tall, this guy here is tall, but this one here is short. Because again, as long as you have that capital T, you're going to be tall. It's dominant. This one lacks it. It's going to be short, like this mom. You'll note how that trait was masked in this generation. We didn't have any short ones. So that's how that's going to work out. You'll get plenty of practice doing that too. So here is your breakup of alleles. In pea plants, the genes that control stem height have 2 alleles. Other genes might have more or less. But we get one tall, which is a capital T, and one short, which is lowercase t. It's always going to be the letter of the dominant trait, and the dominant one will be capital, the recessive will be lowercase. So in this case, capital T is tall, lowercase t is short. They get one allele from each parent. So our first parent was purebred, meaning it had the same 2 alleles. Our second parent was also purebred, but it was short, so it had those 2 alleles. Or it could have a combination of one or the other. In this case here, we never actually write it lowercase t, capital T. We always put the capital first, so that's why this is in parentheses. It's not really a good way to write it, but when you do your crosses, you might get it that way. So just got to switch it around when you get that. So dominant versus recessive. Basically, traits are going to be controlled by inherited alleles. Some alleles are dominant and some are recessive. The dominant allele is present, then you will have the dominant trait. Hands down, the recessive one gets masked. If no dominant allele is present, then you only have recessive alleles, and therefore you get the recessive trait. That's pretty self-explanatory. If dominant exists, you're going to be dominant. If you don't have the dominant one, it'll be recessive. In pea plants, tall is dominant. So these here are your allele combinations you can get. You should note that this one here has capital T, capital T, capital T, so they're all tall. No capital T, so it is short. Pretty straightforward. Mendel's F1 generation only had this combination right here, that capital T, lowercase t, so therefore they were all going to be tall. Mendel's F2 generation had a combination. 2 of them had the combination, the hybrid alleles, while one of them had both tall and one of them had both short, and that's why the short one would come back. Symbols for alleles are pretty simple. I've already talked about them, but just get them in your notes. Letters represent alleles. Dominant allele is always the capital letter. Recessive allele is always the lowercase letter. If different alleles, if alleles dominant is, and when you write it with the capital letter first, that's what that's saying. Yeah, you can't talk there. But yeah, if you have a combination of them, the dominant letter always gets written first.